Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of 2D Fundamentals. My name is Kasanas, and the last episode we discussed spine and the double pendulum. In today's episode, I'd like to discuss the idea of a bouncing ball. All right, guys, let's get started. Okay, guys, so let's take a look at this bouncing ball, and we're going to use it to describe the principles. The first principle, squash and stretch, and the 10th principle, exaggeration. Now, squash and stretch, for many people, lots of people consider squash and stretch to be one of the most important principles of animation. In fact, for me, I don't. If I had to pick one that was the most important, I probably would pick timing. If I had to rank them, timing would be, I think, the one that for me that was the most important. But squash and stretch gives you a lot of information about the actual object and about the material, and it greatly informs the way your animation is going to look. Okay, it gives you information about the weight of the material, about the flexibility of the material of the object you're looking at, about the speed at which it's moving at, of the material, and the precise material it's made out of. If it's something that's hard, it's not going to stretch as much as if something that's like rubber or something like that. However, the problem with squash and stretch is if it's overused, it's not a problem. It's not a problem, I should say. Uh, if squash and stretch is overused, you get this unrealistic look. It becomes far more cartoony, far more comical than it would be if you don't apply a lot of squash and stretch. The idea behind exaggeration is really an imitation of reality. Reality is often really, really boring, and by exaggerating that reality, you can bring a lot more action and emphasize a particular action. You bring your animation to life by exaggerating the actual animation itself. Um, but if you want to stay true to reality, you don't want to over exaggerate it. All right, the really extreme forms of exaggeration will lead to, again, a kind of comic look to your animation. Now, let's take a look at the ball itself. If we're thinking about a ball, and we're going to be looking at a constant ball here, a ball that has no decay, something that we can actually loop through. Um, what we want to consider is a couple of different things. If this is the ball's apex, this is the highest point that the ball is going to reach. Basically, how this ball is going to work is it's going to slow out of its apex. It's going to hit the ground, and the frame immediately before it squashes, and we'll take a look at that in a second. The frame immediately before it squashes, this ball will be traveling at its fastest speed. Okay, at its fastest speed. That's the fastest this ball will be going. If you don't do it like that, this ball will look like it is slowing into the ground. So that's extremely important. When the ball leaves the ground, the ball squashes and then moves back upwards. The fastest this ball will be moving is the frame immediately after the squash when it's traveling back upwards. Afterwards, gravity itself takes over and pulls the ball back down. So we're going to have a slow in to our apex. All right, so let's take a look. If our ball is traveling downwards in this direction, let's head over here. We start off with our ball at its apex. As the ball travels downwards, we can see we've got ourselves a slow out of its position. We can see that the distance it's traveling is growing more and more. As the ball travels downwards, we can start to stretch the ball. Now let's take a look at that particular frame. Let me get rid of these for a minute. The ball itself has started to squash in the direction of travel. Now, once again, that's pretty important. You want to squash in the direction of travel. Now, I simply scaled this ball down. You could, if you wanted to, make this slightly more tear-shaped, or etc. If you wanted to exaggerate the way this ball was falling, something like that would be perfectly fine. For demonstration purposes, all I did was really scale this ball. Now, if you take a look here, what you will see is that I maintain volume. If we take a look at the ball, it's how round the ball was at the apex. The ball is wider here than it is here. As I stretched the ball in the direction of travel, I made sure I squashed the ball's width so that I maintained volume of this actual ball. I don't want this ball to grow. If I had simply taken this ball and instead of changing the width so it was just as wide as it was at the beginning, this ball would look like it had grown bigger, and that's not what we want to do at all. All right. So if you're trying to make sure that this thing looks like it's maintaining its volume, you want to make sure you squash it in one direction and stretch it in the other. All right. Squash it in the opposite direction that you're stretching it. Okay. So here we go again. We've got ourselves a ball that is going faster and faster. We can see the distance is traveling, is getting larger. This distance is wider as we go. The frame immediately before, this is the ball is now touching the ground. The frame immediately before the ball squashes, it's going to travel its greatest distance. All right. I have the most stretch at this point as well. I've really exaggerated this motion. Okay. I've really exaggerated the distance it travels. And something about impact as well. If I had taken, let's say I had taken this ball, and this is my final squash. This is my final squash position. So you can see that the ball itself is touching the ground already at this point. If I hadn't done that, let's say I had taken this last stretch ball and I had moved it up to somewhere like this. Now we still had, at this point, we still had a really nice slow out of our first position, and we can see that it's getting faster and faster at this point here. But at the last frame, just before it squashes, it's only traveling this little tiny distance. All right, and that's going to get the ball a look like it's slowing in, and you don't want that. By having the ball itself land here, let me just go back here. I did that wrong. By having the ball itself, there we go. By having the ball itself touch the ground just before the squash occurs, by having it touching the ground just before the squash occurs, it really exaggerates the impact of this ball as well. All right, it looks like it's really hitting the ground very, very hard. Okay, so that's when the ball is traveling in this direction. The ball is, like I said, slowed out, moving greater and greater speeds. The frame immediately before it squashes, it's touching the ground. So I've actually got it. Let's get rid of all these frames so we can see them. Let's get rid of all these. Let's turn our arrow back on. Just before our ball squashes, we have it stretched to its maximum amount it's going to stretch, and it's traveled its farthest distance. Afterwards, bam, the ball hits the ground, it squashes down. Now, once again, I have maintained volume. If I squash the ball downwards, I have to stretch the ball in the opposite direction. All right, I've maintained the volume of this ball. Now, as this ball travels in the opposite direction, as it travels upwards, let me get rid of this and turn this on. As this ball travels upwards, what we have to know is that the ball is going to stretch upwards once again. And what I want to make sure, actually, let's turn this off, turn this one on. What I want to make sure is that this distance traveled, this distance here, is the greatest distance that this ball is going to travel upwards. It currently is moving its fastest speed. This is as fast as it's going to go upwards. Afterwards, gravity takes over and the ball was going to slow into its next position. All right. So again, the ball itself, I had a squash down here. I had a stretch as it shot back upwards, and the ball immediately popped back into. And you didn't have to make it pop. You could obviously make it grow, stretch over a longer period of time. The ball itself slowly moves up into. It slows into its final apex once again. All right, and the cycle repeats. All right, that is the concept behind the simple no decay bouncing ball. This will give you a good loop. Okay, so a couple of points to remember. We have to remember our apex, that's as high as we want to go, and in the apex we want to match the frame, the first frame to the last frame. The other extremely important frames are this one here, which is the squashed frame. All right, the squashed frame, when it hits the ground, the distance when it's traveling downwards, all right, and the frame immediately before it hits the ground right here, it's going to be touching the ground. Immediately before it squashes, it's going to be touching the ground, and it's going to be stretched to its maximum stretch. On the way back up, it's going to move its maximum distance. So those 4 frames are the ones that are the most important, really, as far as this particular exercise is concerned. All right, guys, let's take a look at my bouncing ball in action. Okay, we can see that the ball itself is hitting a point. It's returning to its apex. I've got a good stretch before it hits the ground. The ball hits the ground. It squashes an appropriate amount. I've maintained volume throughout the entire thing. Afterwards, as the ball moves upwards, it moves its maximum distance on the frame after the squash and moves back into its apex in a slow in. All right, guys? Great. Now let's take a look at a ball that's traveling with decay. Okay, guys, you can see in this example we've got a ball that comes in from the right-hand side and it bounces to a stop. All right, so this is kind of an accumulation of all the exercises we've done at this point here. We've got ourselves an a slow in and a slow out when the ball's bouncing up and down. We also have a slow in to the ball itself stopping on the screen, and we actually have this ball traveling in arcs as it bounces up and down. So we've really got a lot of the things are coming together in this simple exercise. Okay, what we can see about this ball, there's a couple things we can see about this ball. Depending on the amount of squash and stretch we've given it, and the amount of bounce back, or the amount of upwards motion we get as the ball bounces, we can determine a lot about what the type of material this ball is. This ball is obviously not an Indian rubber ball or anything like that. It's obviously a ball that is somewhat heavy, somewhat solid. It's got a little bit of squash to it, so it only travels a certain distance, and it doesn't travel very, very high upwards again. All right, this is obviously a heavier, more solid ball. All right, it's not a simple, really, really elastic ball or anything like that. All right, a couple of things to take note of, however. As the ball is bouncing, and we are actually having the ball bounce forward, there's a couple of things. Let's take a look at it over here in Photoshop. As the ball is bouncing, what we should be doing, let's get over here. Let's turn off a lot of these things. As the ball itself comes in, and I'm just going to do this really, really quickly, so it's not going to look exactly the way it should. Not exactly like it does over here. I don't actually have an example. Apparently I've deleted it. But I don't have the example, unfortunately. So let's take a look. I'll redo it here in Photoshop really, really quick. All right, so let's go back. We've got ourselves this ball squash as the ball hits the ground. No, this one here, sorry, as the ball's coming close to the ground. A couple things we want to make sure we do. And let's turn this one here on, and we'll turn off all of these for now. And I'll use this ball stretch upwards. A couple of things we want to make sure we take note. All right, let's say our ball is falling and we've got a stretch to it. I'm going to actually take this, I'm going to physically move it over here. Uh-oh, did the wrong thing. I don't want to grab all that. I only want to grab this guy. Let's say this ball itself is physically falling. You can see right now I've got a stretch. This one here, where the actual ball is stretched at its maximum just before it's the ground, we've got ourselves a stretch as well. A couple things we don't want to do. We don't want to stretch the ball in this direction, in an up and down direction. The whole point is that we have stretch in the direction of travel. All right, so in the case of this ball fall, let me just rotate this, transform, let's rotate it. We're going to want to make sure we're stretching in the direction of travel. The same thing is true of the, yes, apply it, of this ball stretch. All right, let's edit, let's rotate this one here, transform, rotate it, and let's do this. We are once again going to make sure that we are moving in the direction of travel. We're stretching in the direction of travel. In this case, I want to make sure that I'm again hitting the ground. All right, let's move this ball fall. Yes, I want to apply it. Let's move this ball fall as well a little bit. All right, the ball itself is going to hit the ground. It's going to squash again in exactly the same way. So at this point here, all of these ones here are good. Let me get rid of this squash over here. All of these right here are really, really good. It comes in, it squashes. Now when the ball is leaving this stretch upwards, once again, it's going to leave in the direction of travel. So once again, I'm going to do this in here, and it's going to edit, rotate. I'm going to rotate it in the direction of travel. All right, this is the direction I want it to go. Let me just apply that, and let's put this ball on. Oops, wrong thing. This one here, let's move this over. All right, now the ball itself, this is the way it's going to move. It's going to move like this. Well, let's turn these off. Turn these off. The ball is falling down. Let's even turn on one more of these, and let's move it over. All right, the ball is coming in at an arc. It's coming in at an arc. It is stretching in the direction of travel. It stretches further in the direction of travel, and it actually hits the ground. At the point when it hits the ground, the ball itself squashes. All right, so we've got ourselves our squash. The ball itself squashes, and when it springs back upwards, it moves in the direction it's going to be traveling. Once again, it's stretching in the direction it's going to be traveling. All right, and we get ourselves an arc again. Now, how high this ball bounces is going to be determined by the material it's made out of and what have you. All right, if a lot of energy is lost in this squash, if this was something else like a bag of jello that you've thrown on the ground, this squash is going to, a lot of the energy is going to be absorbed in that actual squash. It's not going to be maintained over the squash. It's going to maintain its squashed out form. All right, in this case here, where I had this ball traveling like this, and I've got this elongated form where it's really stretching, and then it stretches and squashes down a lot, and a lot of the energy is put back into the ball. The ball is bouncing up much, much higher. All right, let's take a look at the finished product once more. Here we go, and as we can see here, I've obviously lost some energy. My ball bounces about half the height it's supposed to bounce after it's hit the ground. It bounces, and then rolls to a stop. All right, guys, that is the exercise I would like you guys to take care of this week. I'd like you to focus on making yourself a ball bounce loop. After you've got a ball bounce loop, try making your ball come in from one side or the other and roll to a stop. That's really an accumulation of everything you've learned up to this point. All right, we've got arcs, we've got exaggeration, we've got slow in, we've got slow out, we've got our timing. Everything is there. Everything is what it should be. All right, guys, I really hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to see your stuff. I'd love to see what you've got going on. All right, guys, post links because I always love to see them. All right, guys, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments down below, and if you haven't done so, please take a few seconds to subscribe. Have yourselves a wonderful day, everyone.